I don't blame you. I think Jim Schwartz is thinking it's Buffalo, too, with all the signings they've made.
Well, before we get to Jim Schwartz, talk about Nolan Carroll. The Eagles re-signed him this morning. Nolan Carroll announced it on his Instagram, and then everybody caught wind of it. He's going to be here on a one-year, $2.3 million deal, it looks like. So talk about how that impacts Jim Schwartz' defense.
Well, yeah, I think it's a good deal. I think the Eagles would have liked to have him on longer than a one-year deal, but when you have a guy get hurt like that, obviously his market value is going to go down. So I think that the Nolan Carroll camp was looking for more when they were going to they visited the Cowboys, and they were just kind of put feelers out there. The Dolphins were another team that could have potentially been interested, but when you have that injury, Nolan Carroll's thinking his stock is going to go up. So I don't really think a multi-year deal is possible. So I think what the Eagles ended up with was good for them. Only $2.3 million for this year. It's a good value for them. It will be good for them to have more of a sure thing at cornerback. Because Eric Rowe is a guy who I think he's going to be good, but he's still just going to be a second-year guy. And I think definitely showed improvement at the end of last season. But, how much can you count on him to be a consistently good starter in just year two? And then Leodis McKelvin, you don't really know. He had his best year as an NFL player under Jim Schwartz back in 2014 when Schwartz was the Buffalo defensive coordinator. But we don't know if McKelvin will really be a good starter at cornerback. So I think it really gives you, really addresses a position of need because, like I said, you don't know about McKelvin. Rowe is a question mark. And then Ron Brooks is a guy who's more of like a nickelback. You don't really expect him to be a starting cornerback. So it really kind of solidifies that position a little bit. Even though it doesn't do it long term, it shores it up at least some in the short term.
Is best case scenario for the Eagles Carroll to be on the outside or the nickel corner at this point?
I think best case scenario is outside. I think he showed that he can be on the outside. When he was playing and when he was healthy, he was the better cornerback between he and Byron Maxwell, particularly early on. Maxwell definitely narrowed the gap as the season progressed, and he got more comfortable with the Eagles. But Nolan Carroll was the more consistent guy you could count in and game out. And then you could have Eric Rowe on the other side. Leodis McKelvin, to me, is kind of the wild card that could change how this plays out because Carroll has obviously shown that he can be effective in the nickel spot as the fifth defensive back. But, if McKelvin is not able to beat out Carroll's outside spot, obviously you put Carroll there. So right now, I would predict that Nolan Carroll and Eric Rowe will be the two outside corners in Week 1.
Josh Paunil with us, Birds 24/7. And Josh, with Nolan Carroll then re-signing today, the Eagles, do you think that they're slowing down in this free agency period, or there's still some guys out there they're looking at, and if so, who?
Well, yeah, that's one thing that you'd expect them to do, especially at wide receiver with how young they are. Jordan Matthews and Josh are some of the most experienced guys they have at wide receiver. So you definitely expect them to sign a better receiver, definitely not, a top-tier guy. When you come into this time in the free agency, this is when things get slower. You're going to expect them to kind of wait and see how the market plays out. So, among the receivers that I think the Eagles could target, you were thinking that guys like Andre Holmes, but, obviously he ended up going elsewhere. So kind of the targets that they've had at that veteran receiver position have kind of disappeared. So it's really going to be interesting to see how aggressive they're going to be because obviously you don't want to pay, a mid-tier guy too much, but this is a receiving core that you definitely want to get some experience because Jordan Matthews said, now I think this is something that would surprise Eagles fans. He said after the season, like guys like Brad Smith, when he was a rookie, really helped his development just because when you have those veterans who can help you with small things about technique or watching film or just, stuff like eating or sleeping and just basic things that are fundamental to being an NFL player that you don't really think about, the veterans really help with. And when you have such a young receiving core that you've invested so much in, you have a first-round pick, a second-round pick, and a third-round pick, you want to make the most of those investments. So I definitely think they'll add a veteran receiver, but it seems like their options are they're not completely disappearing, but they're going away a little quicker than they probably anticipated.
Is there a guy out there, Josh, that's on NFL and still available that you think is a likely candidate for the Eagles, or do you think the jury is still out and the Eagles are kind of just seeing how the market plays out overall?
Well, I think that it's definitely a big part of it's just going to be seeing how the market plays out because the really where you can get the best deals in free agency is when you have situations where guys you may not have been interested in at first because you thought they would get big money, but those guys explore free agency, don't get the deals they were hoping for, and are willing to sell for less. One guy that they've been connected to that I'm curious about is Nick Fairley, the defensive tackle for the Rams. You've seen Jim Schwartz have success with those types of defensive tackles. And, obviously defensive tackle is not a big need. You have Fletcher Cox, you have Benny Logan. But to get some depth, and if they can get a good deal and they can bring him in as a very good third defensive tackle, he's a guy that I think could certainly be in the mix just to make that defensive line more robust and just more of a strength for the team than it already is, because although you have those quality starters, it obviously doesn't hurt to get quality depth at a good price.
Josh Paunil with us, Birds 24/7 on PhillyMag.com. So let's play draft for a little bit and look at that, Josh, for a second. And if just at the quarterback position alone, the Eagles obviously move up from 13 to 8. So of those two names that jump out at quarterback, Carson Wentz or Jared Goff, why don't you describe what you think the strengths and weaknesses are of both those guys?
Well, Carson Wentz he's really kind of the high ceiling guy. When you hear analysts and just people talk about guys' potential, Carson Wentz is going to be that guy. He seems to have the higher ceiling. He has great size, good athleticism. He can run. Obviously, he's not going to be run the read option for the Eagles, but it doesn't hurt to have a mobile quarterback who can get outside the pocket. He's a guy who really showed that he can work through progressions and read the entire field. Obviously, that's something in college, or especially coming from North Dakota State. I'm guessing many people wouldn't expect that at North Dakota State. Carson Wentz would be used to working through progressions and doing things more similar to the NFL than other systems. Because in a lot of, maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but in many big-time college programs, the quarterbacks don't necessarily have to go to the third and fourth reads. That was a thing with RG3, a question mark when he was coming out of Baylor was, well, obviously he's had a lot of success, but he never had to go to those third and fourth reads. He didn't need to read the defenses as much because his first and second options were open. So Carson Wentz, even though he played at North Dakota State, he actually had more, NFL preparedness than you would expect. And then Jared Goff is kind of the opposite, just in terms of he does seem to be a guy that has a pretty high ceiling, but he's the more NFL-ready quarterback right now. Carson Wentz isn't a guy who you'd really want to come in and start from day one. And Jared Goff, I don't think you'd want really any rookie quarterback to be starting for you day one, but if you had to pick one, it would be Jared Goff. He's the guy that the experience that he has and just the fundamentals and the skill set that he has, the footwork, the pocket mobility, the size like Wentz, and the NFL arm. That's the other thing that Goff has is, you hear guys, well, can they make all the throws? Jared Goff can make all the throws, but he can make them in different situations. He can do it, out of different formations or out of the gun. He can do it while scrambling. So he's a guy that, Goff is the sure thing right now, but Carson Wentz is kind of the gamble, but the longer term, he could be the better quarterback.
Speaking of the NFL draft, Josh, there's a lot of speculation about who the Eagles may not pick. I know a lot of names have been thrown out there, from Taylor Decker to Ezekiel Elliott. Who is a guy who you think, looking at the draft, because we know the quarterbacks are probably not going to be there by the time the Eagles pick. There's a lot of speculation that Miles Jack may or may not drop, but of the top 10 guys who are projected to go, who is the guy who you think best fits the Eagles' needs at this point?
Well, the guy that best fits the Eagles' needs, I think, is Ronnie Stanley, the offensive tackle from Notre Dame. He's a guy, he started at Notre Dame for 3 years. He's a guy that scouts say he has good foot quickness. And the one thing that really stands out about him is pass protection. He seems like he'll have, from the get-go, that he'll be able to have provide great pass protection. And the one, I don't want to say question mark, but the one thing that you aren't as sure about with him as other offensive tackles is, with how big he is, he's 6'6", over 300 pounds. Will he be able to shift inside at guard initially? Because obviously you'd expect Jason Peters to play left tackle, Lane at right, and you'd fit the offensive lineman that the Eagles pick at left guard. But I don't think that's as big of an issue. But Ronnie Stanley fits the biggest need. But Miles Jack, if the Eagles can pick Miles Jack, I think it would be very, very difficult for them to resist, because he's a guy that he would fit Jim Schwartz's defense so well. He's really the kind of the aggressive mindset. He would fit that attacking mentality perfectly. So even though Ronnie Stanley would fit, offensive line's more of a need, the way that Miles Jack, the UCLA linebacker, fits Jim Schwartz's scheme would be perfect. And I also think Miles Jack is simply the better player. Now you have potential injury concerns, but those seem to be kind of more, more preliminary. The latest reports about Miles Jack is that he'll be fine and that there shouldn't really be any lingering effect. So if they can get Miles Jack, I think they should absolutely take him, but it's not very clear if he'll be able to fall that far to number 8.
Josh, we talked potential quarterbacks earlier. Let's talk actual quarterbacks on the roster and talk about Sam Bradford and Chase Daniel. I heard somebody yesterday throw out an opinion that the signing of Chase Daniel undermines the deal that they gave Sam Bradford. Do you give any weight to a comment like that, or how do you think their relationship is going to be going forward?
To be honest, I think that's a ridiculous comment. I mean, when the Chase Daniel signing was first announced and people talked about how much money he was getting, to be honest, I thought it was funny that people were talking about how much money Chase Daniel got and that it was a sign that maybe he would be the starting quarterback. Well, Chase Daniel is going to get $7 million a year, okay? And for Sam Bradford, he's going to get at least $18 million for this 1 year. So when you compare the salary figures, they're not even close. And then you also have the simple fact that Doug Peterson has said very clearly many times, Sam Bradford is our number 1, Chase Daniel is our number 2. And in terms of the relationship between the two, Sam Bradford is essentially on a 1-year deal anyway. And this is why I like the Sam Bradford deal in the way that Howie Roseman structured it, because the Eagles can get out of this deal after year 1. So if Sam Bradford does not work out, say he gets hurt, or for whatever reason, he doesn't progress and it doesn't pan out, they can cut him. And so when you have a situation like that, if you're Sam Bradford, you're already literally playing for your career and for your next contract and for your future. So bringing in competition and bringing in a second quarterback, I don't really think that adds too much pressure when you already have a ton of pressure on you just to, be a quarterback in Philadelphia, but more importantly, play for your future NFL career. So I really don't think it will bother their relationship. To be honest with you, I think it will help Sam Bradford. That's one of the reasons I think the Eagles brought in Chase Daniel, was not to undermine Sam Bradford, but to help Sam Bradford and a young quarterback who they could potentially draft, get adjusted to the system, help teach them the terminology and other small things like that, because Chase Daniel does have that expertise and that fluency in Doug Peterson's West Coast system. So I like the signing. I think this quarterback competition is completely made up and blown out of proportion. But that I could go on a whole rant about that, guys. I mean, I really think that's kind of
I knew it was a good one to light your fire there. I knew that would light your fuse.
Yeah, I really think this whole quarterback competition is just a media creation by some people, and that it's really the only way Chase Daniel is going to be the starter on day 1 is if Sam Bradford gets hurt. I mean, there's no more so a competition at quarterback than there will be at defensive tackle. Like, theoretically, is Bo Allen in a competition with Fletcher Cox? I mean, sure, you can say that they're in a competition, but I don't think Bo Allen's going to beat him out. I like Bo Allen. I think he'll provide some good depth, but I think it's fair to say that he's not going to beat out Fletcher Cox. And at quarterback, it's the same thing. Yes, it's good to have a guy pushing you, and you could call it a competition, but I think it's a little disingenuous to suggest that Sam Bradford is not the guy, at least in 2016.
Josh Paunil of Birds247 at PhillyMag.com. Josh, I wanted to flip it back over to the defense. We're talking about Jim Schwartz earlier. We've seen them bring in a lot of Bills players, but it's not just the players from Buffalo he's brought in. It's the type of mentality those players are. It seems like he's bringing in a lot of guys, including Rodney McLeod, Bradham, guys like Brooks. These are a lot of guys, if you look them up on the internet, you kind of pull up their game film and things like that. These are guys who are aggressive. These are guys who are hard-hitting players who don't really seem to give up big plays. Even McKelvin, he hasn't lived up to expectations per se from his first-round pick, but at times he has shown when he's healthy he can be a very good player. Talk a little bit about the influence of Jim Schwartz on the players the Eagles have taken in free agency so far.
Yeah, and I think it's funny you mentioned that because I think that's something that's really been overlooked. I'm happy you brought that up because obviously a big reason Jim Schwartz brought in the 3 Buffalo guys was that they already know the terminology, they know the scheme, they can help others develop in the system. But the other reason he wants them is, A, they all have their best years in the NFL under him, and that's mainly because of that attacking mindset he has. And that's going to be the biggest difference that you see in this Eagles defense. Obviously, you're going to see just a simple alignment shift from the 3-4 to the 4-3, but the more apparent change will be the attacking, the just go after the ball. And that really goes from all 3 levels, from defensive line. I think that's really going to help Fletcher Cox just not having – I mean, you thought Fletcher Cox was good last year, in this 2-gap 3-4. Wait till you see him in a 4-3-1 gap where he can just attack the ball. And then you see it spread to the linebackers with Bradham. And then the secondary, you have guys like McKelvin, who really what he excels at in his game when he's healthy is the press coverage, getting physical at the line of scrimmage, try to disrupt the route before it can really get going. It's not going to be a lot of sitting back and just watching things happen. It won't be, okay, let's give these guys a 10-yard cushion and we'll give them, these 6- and 7-yard routes and just let them march down the field because we're too scared to go with the deep ball. They're going to get up in your face. And then you have the safety, Rodney McLeod from St. Louis, who he's not a big guy, but that doesn't really matter in the Jim Schwartz scheme because it's less about size and more about mentality. And that's another area that I think really shows the difference between kind of the Chip Kelly way of selecting personnel and then the Jim Schwartz, at least on defense, and how the type of guys that he would like the Eagles to bring in because they aren't really looking for the prototypical size. Obviously, if you have the prototypical size at whatever position you're considering, that's a plus. But the main thing is that attacking, aggressive mentality, going after the ball, and just really the hard hit. And I really think that's going to be something that the Philadelphia fans like. Because they're just going to be good. I really think this defense is going to take a step up, and they're going to be much closer to how they played in the first half of last season compared to the second half. But also, it's just going to be kind of the Philadelphia mentality. And I think these blue-collar guys that you have on the team, they're really going to reflect who the city would like to see represent them. And then Brandon Brooks, even on the offensive side, is representative of that because he is an enormous guy to have at guard. But you know what? It's okay that he doesn't fit the height and size requirements because he's good and because he can block. And so I think that's one of the biggest differences you can see in the Eagles' approach to picking personnel. It sounds obvious, but when you consider how they approach picking the personnel last year to this year, those those size parameters are really less of an issue, and it's more about football.
Hey, Josh, since we were talking defense a little bit there, are we as fans, are we as people that follow this game, too in love with the sack? Is that an overrated stat, or is that something that you put credence on to how well or poorly a defense is playing on how many sacks they average?
I mean, it's obviously important, and it's obviously going to be what gets guys that big money. But I do think people can put – maybe it's not that they overemphasize sacks, but I think they underemphasize pressures and hurries. I thought that was one thing that Vinny Curry – he was really underrated this year in his impact, I thought, because you would see on the film a lot of times where he would get pressure, and he wouldn't get a sack, but he would push the quarterback out of the pocket. He'd force an incompletion. He'd make the quarterback throw it before the receiver was ready. He would make the quarterback, get off his mark and throw it on the run, which is obviously more difficult than just sitting back in the pocket. And he would draw holding calls. So I really thought that was something, particularly with Vinny Curry. It's just the number of hurries and the number of pressures he got because the sack numbers obviously weren't there, partially because he didn't play as much as he probably should have, but also because the impact is more than just sacks. It's about influencing the quarterback. I mean, that's the biggest thing in your pass rushers. You want sacks, but you want to influence the quarterback, and that's something with Vinny Curry that I thought he'd do well. And Fletcher Cox, too. Fletcher Cox, obviously he had the 3-sack game, forcing fumbles, but he had many games where he would take up 2 blockers, push the pocket back, and he would just completely disrupt the timing of the play. So I do think that sacks can be overrated, but it's less about sacks being overrated and other elements being underrated.
Josh, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you one more question. You mentioned Fletcher Cox. They've talked all offseason. We've heard again and again from Howie and Doug about how, we want Fletcher Cox to the future. We're working on re-signing him, but he seems to be the only guy they haven't signed or re-signed at this point. Is there something particular that's holding that up? Or is, maybe Fletcher or the Eagles side kind of seeing how the market plays out overall with defensive linemen?
I think it's partially a product of just the Eagles focusing on other things. Obviously, Fletcher Cox is a priority, and they want to get that done. But I think you're going to see them focus. Well, this more so applied to last week, but they're going to address the players that they need to get in the building. This week and next week, you have time to get this Fletcher Cox deal done. And you have the off season. I would be shocked if they didn't have a deal done before camp. This is kind of thinking more long term, but the reason I say that is because they have time to get this Fletcher Cox deal done. And Howie Roseman has said this, and you can really see it with how they're structuring these contracts. All the moves they're doing it with that Fletcher Cox deal in the back of their mind. They're doing it with the thought of, okay, if we structure the contract like this, will we still be able to sign Fletcher Cox to that big deal we know we're going to have to give them? And the answer is yes, they've been doing that. And so they're capable of signing Fletcher Cox at any moment, but I think that's something that they're more relaxed about because it doesn't have to happen right this second. Although I'm sure Eagles fans wish the Fletcher Cox deal would happen today. It's something that's just when you have these other things, you have to bring back Nolan Carroll. You need to address that quarterback position, or maybe you need to bring in another offensive lineman. When you have these situations where you need guys to get them into the building as soon as possible, that means Fletcher Cox maybe not be the number one priority every morning when they wake up.
Josh Paunil, you can read more of his stuff at birds247 at phillymag.com. Appreciate you coming on a little earlier this week because of the NCAA tournament on Thursday. We usually have you on Thursdays. Great to have you on. Appreciate all the insights.
Thanks for having me, guys.